Thank you so much. You may be seated. Here's the book, by the way. Don't have it? You want to get it? Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Okay. Dr. Buddy acted like you had to twist my arm to come help with God the Entrepreneur. The truth of the matter is, we did have to wait for God's timing, but I'm so excited because I love seeing how God works in so many different ways. You know, I grew up I grew up in the church, but my profession has always been in the area of business. And that was more than a little bit of a departure from my family. Anybody who was at my wedding knows, as my friend said, you had more preachers there than I think a whole conference does, you know? And most of them were my family. So I come from a background of pastors and preachers and folks that are in ministry. And so I was a little bit of a renegade. No, I was a lot of a renegade when I took off in a different direction. And I don't know why I had a passion for business, honestly. My dad was not really a businessman. We didn't really have business people in our family necessarily. And so I just have to believe that that's something God dropped in my heart. And he did it in an interesting way. He kind of dropped a love for travel, and I could have done ministry and travel, but I saw that the missionaries didn't really make a whole lot of money, and I was tired of not having a whole lot of money, so I decided business was the way to go. I act like I had a plan, but I didn't. God did, though. And so business has always been fascinating to me, but I've never lost my love and my passion for ministry in God's church. And what I began to see over the years is that often God will use the illustration and the working out of things in business before the church gets it. And you know, I have often said the reason business hears God before the church does is because in business, if you don't hear God, you don't survive. You don't stay in business. And so there is a keenness. Now, does everybody acknowledge and recognize that it's God they're hearing? Usually not. But there is a reality in the way that God communicates with us. And when we hear him and when we get his principles, Dr. Buddy has taught over and over again, God's principles bring life. And so businesses figure that out real quick. You know, you want to succeed in business, you get some godly principles going and you'll start to see a difference. If you start to veer from those principles, then things can go off course real quick and you're out of business. So when we begin to look at God the Entrepreneur, and Dr. Buddy began to, you know, because we had to reformat things, it really honed our approach to how we look at everything. At least it did for me. Dr. Buddy's always had this, but I really began to think more and more in terms of the format and the framework that God had given him in God the Entrepreneur. Now, if you're not familiar with that framework, it's kind of a simple framework. It's called P1, P2, and P3. Now, that doesn't mean anything until you find out what P1 means. P1 is the perspective. In other words, it's your vision. It's where are we headed with this thing. It's God's approach to things. What is God saying? What is the vision that he's casting? And when you align with that, the next thing you got to look at is, okay, so what are the processes, P2? What's the process that I need to do in order to align with the vision? P3 is the people. Who are the people? What is the attitude? What's the approach that I have to have? So this P1, P2, P3, very simple approach is incredibly profound. So when Dr. Buddy and I began to talk about the parables, and he asked me to look at the parables, I kind of, I guess by habit, went to P1, P2, and P3. And the first thing I asked myself is, okay, what was the purpose? What was the vision? What's the P1 here that we're looking for? And the reality was that what God said, and by the way, parables are not something that just happened in the New Testament. And honestly, this was a little bit of a shock for me because I'd never really thought about it until I began to do some study around the parables. Do you know that God began talking in parables as early as the garden? One of the most famous parables that came to my mind was the parable around David. And you remember Nathan the prophet, when David had stolen Uriah, had killed Uriah and stolen Bathsheba from him. God sent a prophet in and gave David a parable. And the parable was used to hook him emotionally, but to get him to think about what he'd really done. And whereas, Nathan, that was pretty bold of Nathan, truthfully, because David could have, with a flick of his wrist, had Nathan beheaded. But God used the story, the parable, to hook David's heart and to shift David's heart. And as a result, David came back into an alignment with God. And so the reality was, when we started to see Jesus, and by the way, you remember, Jesus didn't do anything except through a parable. He didn't talk to the people except through a parable. And I found that fascinating. I mean, Jesus was the master communicator. He could have used any and every allegory, tool, you name it. But he chose the stories. He chose parables as a way to communicate his message. Well, the first thing was why? Why was that needed? We all know that Jesus came as the defining sacrifice, the defining image of who God was. But he really had to do something even bigger than that. He had to do a culture shift. Now, because my background is business, I kind of frame everything from a business perspective. So if I look at it from a business perspective, you have to write a plan in business. And when you have your plan, you work your plan and you stick to your plan, and occasionally you adjust your plan, but your plan becomes your guide. And God had a plan for the earth. He had a plan for his kingdom in the earth. But what happened was that his original plan got corrupted. You see, he was going to set up a model on the earth because, in business, especially if you're going to duplicate something, we call it a franchise model, right? McDonald's is one of our famous franchise models. Well, you have to have an original before you can start to franchise it. And the original is where you work out all the kinks and the issues, and you kind of streamline things, and you learn what the process is and what works and what doesn't, and what positions need to have. And all of those things happen in your model. And so God, being an ultimate entrepreneur, said, well, let's start with a model. I'm going to call it the garden. And he gave this model to Adam and Eve, and he put in the perfect employees. Adam was incredible. There was nothing Adam couldn't do. He was brilliant. And he said, you need an additional employee in here. And so he brought Eve in. And the two of them together made an incredible team, and they began to run the garden. And they ran it beautifully. They named the animals. They cultivated things. They built. It was an absolutely incredible thing. And as often happens, little employee problem came up. You had one of these employees that kind of got the wrong idea about things, and truth of the matter is, she kind of thought she could run things better than the boss did. She was going to help God, right? Because if I eat of the tree, then I'll be like God. I'll know everything he knows, and I can do it a little better than he can. There's a reason why there's one boss and each person has a position in an organization. Because when you work together, you can get something done. But when you have two people trying to set a vision, you have division. And so they had a problem. And God had to kind of reestablish things. And he said, I hate to tell you, but this is my model, and I can't let you do that. And so you're going to have to step outside. So God went on for a time, and he said, let's try to rebuild. Let's try to reestablish the model. And so he took this group of people that came from a friend of his named Abraham. And he'd made a promise to Abraham, and he said, Abraham, I'm going to prosper you, and I'm going to prosper your people. And so he said, you know what, we'll reestablish the model. And so he pulled them all out of a bad employment situation that they were in. I mean, they weren't getting paid well. They had horrible working conditions. They were abused. And truth of the matter is, they didn't have much training either. And so God said, you know what, I'm going to take this group, and I'm going to take you out, and I'm going to teach and train and activate and mature you. And we're going to create a model of what it's supposed to look like, because I still haven't lost my vision of what my kingdom is going to be. So he got them all out, put them in the desert, and began to explain to them how this model worked. Began to explain to them their roles and their responsibilities, the guidelines, the employee handbook, how all that worked together. And the reality was, they kind of looked at it and went, you know, that looks like a lot of work. And when you really get down to it, what they said was, we don't want to follow the rules. And ultimately, what they said was, I don't like your model, God. And they begin to look at all the competitors around them, the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Havites and the other ites and the Itenites. And they said, you know what? Look how they do things. You know, their employees get weeks and weeks off. And they don't have to follow these silly rules, and they don't have to do that. And you know, boy, they got a great working condition situation. So we're just gonna pick from their model, and we're gonna start to try to do things their way. And what they did was, they took the model that was supposed to be the franchise model. You know, in the franchise model, you're supposed to do everything by the book. It's got to be the example. And they began to corrupt it. And so Jesus began to get, you know, I can just sort of see him. He's sitting there talking to the Father, and he's going, you know, Father, this group of employees is just not working out the way we wanted them to. We're going to need to do some corrections here. And so God said, okay, I'll tell you what, why don't you go down and reestablish the model for us? We're going to send the boss bound from headquarters, and I'm going to ask you to go into the franchise, and we're going to kind of have to do a culture change in the franchise, because what we intended to have happen isn't working. And so ultimately, when Jesus came to his own people, to the original franchise group called Israel, what he was really set there to do was a culture shift. You see, he had to get the model back on track. But you know, God doesn't just take things back to their original form, because he's all about making it better. And he said, I'll tell you what, you know, the original model, I don't like the way they've kind of gotten insular. You know, they've kind of turned themselves inward in this. And so what we really need to do is, not only do we need to reestablish the model, but we need to broaden it a little bit. Our market's got real small. And we need to broaden our market. We need to get new customers in this place, you know? So we got to move this model, and you know, we need a little better marketing. And we actually just need to reestablish how we do business. And so ultimately, Jesus came to reorganize the business called God's kingdom. And in doing so, he said, we're going to open up the doors, and we're going to make a shift. Now, a number of years ago, I had the privilege of working with a number of folks in doing some culture transformations in some organizations. And over the years, what I noticed is there's patterns that companies establish. You know, companies have personalities. And their personalities are usually driven by their roots, as we all are. And the root, I happened to start my career in an organization, a little teeny group called AT&T. Actually, at the time that I started with them, they were called Ma Bell. It was the Bell system. There were over 1 million employees. It was enormous. And there was a definite culture. Trust me, you did not shift the culture. You adapted to the culture, or the culture spit you out. You know? And the culture that I walked into actually had its beginnings in a more manufacturing-driven basis. Technology, invention, Bell Labs, everybody's heard of Bell Labs. Bell Labs was, that was the house on the hill was Bell Labs. And it created a culture of innovation and technology. And then out of that, you manufactured. And so there's a certain mindset, there's a certain perception. And when I remember the first time the organization that I was working with began to do sales training, and I had a group of salespeople, there were 40 salespeople in the room, and I said, okay, so how many are in sales? Now keep in mind, that's their job description. I had 2 people in the room raise their hand. I thought, did I go to the wrong room? And so I kind of went, all right. I said, so give me some examples. So what is your role? Well, I'm an account executive. Well, I'm a customer engineer. And I mean, I had never heard so many titles that weren't sales in all my life. Because in their mindset, to be a salesperson was a bad thing. Sales were sneaky, and they were slippery, and they were people you couldn't trust. See, they were engineers. Engineers did solid things, and they did things the right way, and you kept doing it until you got it right. And when you got it right, everybody should love it because it was a perfect thing. And we don't need to know what you need. We made it perfect, so here, of course you can use it. And there was literally a mindset of, well, Bell Labs invented it, we made it, so of course you'll buy it. And they thought the idea of salespeople were kind of a waste. Now, that's a mindset, but even though we trained salespeople out the wazoo for the next several years, that mindset remained. That perspective of who they were and what they were there for remained. And until the organization could do a culture shift, until there was a mind shift, they kept running up against problem after problem after problem. Because you can't go into a competitive market with the mindset of, well, because I made it, you should buy it. It doesn't quite work that way. And so part of what I ended up doing for 14 years in the organization was literally trying to do a culture shift. Trying to get people to see there is value in a sales approach. There's value in going to the customer and asking the customer what they actually need, and then coming back and taking all that innovation and excellence and putting it towards actually responding to a customer need. We didn't quite get there. After 14 years, I got frustrated and left. So, but that idea of a culture shift has stayed with me. And so when I began to look at what Jesus came to do, I realized that's what he was doing. He was doing a culture shift. Now, Dr. Buddy has a framework that he's used a couple of times, and it's called a pattern for successful change. I want you to put it up here for just a second. I want you to see how change occurs. Because if you're going to do a change, and this is in any area, by the way, could be cultural, could be business, could be spiritual, could be personal, doesn't matter. If you're going to do a change, there is a core piece that has to be addressed first. And the very first thing you have to address is, how do you perceive the world? What is your perception of the situation? You see, as long as I had an organization that had a perception that manufacturing and what I produced was more important than who I produced it for, I could spin my wheels all day and I wasn't going to get any change. Because fundamentally, the way they perceived the situation was driving everything else. Because your perception drives your perspective. Let me give you a couple of definitions. Your perception, it's the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. Here's some synonyms: recognition, awareness, consciousness, appreciation, realization. It's a way of regarding or understanding or interpreting something. We've talked many times, and Dr. Mary has addressed on many occasions, if we come from a victim mindset, then everything around us is persecuting us. Because my perception is that I am a victim. That's where I'm starting from. And if that's where I start from, then absolutely everything that occurs is touched. Whether I'm conscious of it or not, I make it fit that realization of I'm a victim. You see, your brain is an amazing thing. Your brain will take your perception, your belief system, and it will make everything it sees, perceives, or hears fit that perception. There are literally people who cannot, you can say whatever you want, but they're going to hear it through that perception, through that filter of, I'm a victim. I can't do it. I'm not able to. I don't have the ability. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong. Whatever that is. And unfortunately, those things, those perceptions get laid into us pretty early on in life. And so perception drives our perspective. What is our perspective? Our perspective is a particular attitude or way of looking at something. It's our point of view. It's an outlook. It's a viewpoint. It's a position. It's a stance. It's a frame of mind. So if I start with a perception that is out of alignment with God, then absolutely everything else, and the way it goes is my perception drives my perspective. My perspective drives my attitude. My attitude drives my behavior. And my behavior becomes my habits, and my habits lead to either my success or my lack thereof. My outcomes, if you will. So when Jesus began to look at the situation that he had in front of him, he said, we have got some perspectives that are way out of line. You think about some of the basic ways that the Jews perceived God. First of all, he was big and up there. He was untouchable. He was behind a curtain in the Holy of Holies. Now, there's a wonderful thing to perceive God's holiness and reverence. But when that holiness and that reverence becomes distance, when that holiness and that reverence becomes a barrier, then I have lost all ability to establish relationship. The Jews didn't have a relationship with God. They had a perception of God that he's up here, I'm down here, and the only way the two of us are going to ever, the only way I'm going to deal with this is just by following every teeny little rule I can possibly do. And the more rules that I do, the less likely he is to be upset with me. And if he's not upset with me, then I can see abundance. You know, we see in the book of Job kind of a capsule of the attitude. Job was righteous. He was rigidly righteous in his own eyes. He did everything right. And so as a result, Job had an expectation. I do everything right, God blesses me. And Job didn't change that, but all of a sudden the blessing stopped. And his perception kind of got turned upside down. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. I continued to do all the sacrifices. I continued to do everything right. And the outcome is not what I expect. And as a result, we see coming to the end of the book, he realizes, hey, wait a minute, it's not about that. God, we see kind of a culture shift right there in the book of Job. Well, Jesus came and he said, I got a little work to do here with this crew, because we've got to shift their perspective. We've got to shift everything that they're doing. And so God said, I'm going to do this in 3 ways. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to address the context of their thinking. Bring up that next slide for me here. In the context is designed to reframe or reset the frame of things, right? Your context is where it's the framework that everything else fits inside of. If I'm going to do a puzzle, I do the edges and I do the context of the puzzle first, and then I have a picture to follow that, and then I can begin to fill in with the content. And then once I have the context, what is it supposed to look like, and the content, how am I supposed to respond differently, then I get some instruction, and this is how you continue on in this. So when Jesus came, he was addressing 3 areas. He said, first, let's deal with the context, because their context is all wrong. They have a context of me that is completely out of alignment with who I really am. And so they're thinking in their minds, David, kingdom, God's going to come. He's going to take a sword and whack off all the Romans' heads and subdue everybody again. You see, their context was still rooted in an Old Testament model that David had established. And remember, that was a framework. God said, yes, I'm doing this. This is a type. But that's not who I really am. This is a type. It's a framework, but it doesn't fill in the details of who I really am. And he said, you guys got it wrong. You're looking at this as an earthly kingdom. You're looking at this as a conquering, I'm going to destroy. And you're looking at this as something that's happening from an earthly, natural perspective. You've completely missed the context that you need to see kingdom in. So one of the first things that he had to do was he had to readdress the context of the kingdom of God in their eyes. The next thing that he had to do was he had to begin to challenge the content of their heart, their attitudes. Because again, they had begun to address things externally and not internally. And then with this new model, he had to give them some way to take it and begin to carry on. How do you extend and build kingdom out? So let's look at Jesus' approach. First thing he did was he decided he was going to use parables. Because parables have a unique ability to address all of those things in one fell swoop. A story engages you at an intellectual level. It engages you, if it's well done, at an emotional level. And it can also leave you with a pattern or an instruction that you can begin to move in. We use the story of David and Nathan and how he came in. But one of the things that Jesus had to do was he had to be aware of who he was talking to. You see, your perception of who Jesus is determines your perspective on what he was saying. That's why he could stand and talk to a group, and he had the disciples here and he had the Pharisees over here, and the disciples heard one thing and the Pharisees heard something totally different. Why? Remember, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" In other words, what's your perspective of me? Who do you really see me as? And when Peter said, "You're Christ, you're the Son of God," he goes, yes, that's the perspective, that if you keep that perspective, then everything that you hear me saying and you see me doing is going to make sense to you. You're going to get kingdom. He said, I can build kingdom on that. It wasn't on Peter. It was on Peter's perspective. He said, on this rock, I'm going to build my church. If our perspective of who Jesus is not that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, then everything else that we do is out of whack. Our perspective is off. Selah. You know, I'll tell you, it's hard sometimes when God begins to talk to you through what you're saying to everybody else. By the way, I encourage you all to get the tape from Friday night. God really used Prophet Catherine to bring some real revelation about just that fact. So if you weren't here Friday night, you need to get that tape. All right, so when I began to look at the parables then, and I said, okay, Jesus is here to do a culture shift. And to do a culture shift, you have to change context, you have to change content, and then you have to do instruction. And when I looked at all the parables, surprise, surprise, the parables kind of fall into those three categories. You have parables of context where he's talking about kingdom. Because without the context, the appropriate context for the kingdom, Judas never got it. Judas never got the context for the kingdom right. And we know that because he was frustrated. He was expecting Jesus to ride in, to establish the throne, to bump everybody off, knock the Romans off, and to build his kingdom right then and right there. Now, the other disciples got that. Now, trust me, it was a little hard. It was work turning their perspective. But their perception was he was Christ, he was the Son of God. And so even when their perspective, even when they were like, this doesn't make any sense. You're riding on a donkey. You're coming in and you stand here and you let the Pharisees say these things. Why don't you just, do the hand thing? One of the disciples said, look, why don't we just call down fire on them, Just do the sweeping thing and call down fire and let's get this over with. Even when they didn't understand why he didn't do it, because they had the right perspective on who he was. Wait a minute, this is the Son of God. I may not always get what he's up to, but he's the Son of God. I can eventually get the rest in line if my perspective is right. And so he spent a lot of time, and I love this. Matthew is the book that records most of the parables about kingdom. Now, you see them again in others, but Matthew really focused on kingdom. I started thinking, I wonder why. And then it dawned on me, well, Matthew was an accountant. He was a tax guy. These are number guys. They deal in facts and figures and numbers, and they see big picture. Because, listen, you can take any number you want, and if you take it out of context, it could say anything you want. So, as a tax person, he was like, okay, give me the context for this. What's the framework that this information is going into? And so Matthew, more than any of the other disciples, I think, really got the idea of we got to set a context, and the context is a new way of looking at the kingdom of God. It's a different perspective. So let me have that next slide. If you look, I took, and then this is just a cursory glance, but I took the parables. There's about 35 separate different parables in the New Testament. And these are just a few of them that I came up with. I don't know if you can read them or not. But in that first column there with the light bulb, that's the best I could come up with for context, okay? How do you come up with a graphic for context? So I did a light bulb. Things like the mustard seed, the treasure, the leaven, the costly pearl, the dragnet. All of these are context parables. In fact, many of them actually start with, the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of God is like. Now, I mean, that's pretty blatant. Here it is. I'm resetting your context for how you think about kingdom. Okay? Then you've got the content parables. I use those for keys, right? The content parables. These are addressing, you know what, even if you've got the context right, if your attitude is off, you're going to be in trouble. And so let's talk about your heart issue for a minute. And so the content parables really addressed a lot of what was going on in people's hearts. I mean, he filleted some people. I don't know about you, but I hadn't been called a brood of vipers in a while. But I mean, he knew how to get bam, boom, right there to the heart of it. And then the last area is kind of, I call them the instructional parables. These are ones where it's like, okay, guys, here's what you do. Once you get your perspective right, once you get your heart and your attitude right, now let's talk about what you actually need to do differently, because we do need to do some things differently than we've been doing them, okay? So with those three in mind, let's go to one of the first parables that I want to address. Now, and I wanted to frame up some context for you a little bit today. So let's go to our first parable. And this parable, first of all, had to address a problem. And all of Jesus' parables started with addressing a problem. So let's hear our first problem. Bring that one up for me. So this is the parable of the mustard seed. So he gave them another parable to consider, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And all the seeds planted in the region, it is the smallest. But when it is grown, it's the largest of the garden herbs, and it becomes a tree so that the birds of the air find shelter in its branches. Now, it's interesting. You see that last little phrase there, the birds of the air find shelter in its branches. That's a reference to a comment that Ezekiel made in some of the parables. By the way, Ezekiel used a lot of parables. And it's a touch point to the parable. Ezekiel, probably as much as any prophet, talked about kingdom. And so the minute they heard a phrase that was tied to Ezekiel, they thought about kingdom, because remember, as Ezekiel talked, they were thinking, this is a kingdom that's going to show up right here, right now, and as soon as the Messiah hits the ground, boom, this thing's going to take off and run. And so he was doing a touchstone back to that kingdom idea, so they knew what he was talking about. They understood that he was referencing what Ezekiel had said, but he shifted it on them. He changed the context for them. What was the problem? The problem was that the Jews had a natural, earthly idea of the promised kingdom. They were expecting it to show up right here, right now, and go with the conventional approach that they had always known, that all of the kings that they had seen in the past had gone to. All right, so let's bring that problem up again. So this natural earthly idea had to shift. I can't think of this as something that's about to happen right now. I've got to instead shift my perspective. And the perspective is, this is not going to come in as a big conquering army, because that's what they were expecting, right? Messiah shows up, big army shows up with him, or at the very least, fire rains down from heaven and we get this taken care of. Instead, he said, look, this is going to come in the form of the lowliest little seed that you've ever seen. Yeah. Now, that is about as opposite as you can get from the conquering, swinging the sword, Messiah hero galloping into the rescue. And it kind of messed people up. And so the first thing he said was, and go to the next slide if you would. It says, in this parable of the mustard seed, the first thing that dropped out to me was, if you go to the next slide, which a man took and sowed in his field. Now that was the phrase that jumped out at me. Now, first of all, God is dropping a seed. If you've got a business idea, God drops it in the form of a seed. I don't know about you, but I don't know if it'd be great or not, knowing what I know now. But I think in my mind, it sounds like, well, somebody build this big business and get it all going and get it all set up, and then I'll step in as CEO. Ta-da! Yay, right? God, give me the perfect job, outline it, get everything ready, and then I'll step into the job and be the hero. Do you realize that's exactly what the Jews thought of the Messiah? He's going to do all the hard work. He's going to conquer the enemies. And then we're going to step into this reign of peace and prosperity, and everything's going to be wonderful. We're still trying to do that. We still say to God, God, now if you'll just take care of this, then I'll. And what he's saying is, that's not how kingdom works. Kingdom is, we take it in seed form. It's an idea. It's a thought. It's a passion. It's something you see, a need. And that little need drops in your spirit. It drops in your thinking. And it begins slowly. Listen, the next day when you drop a mustard seed in, boom, you don't have this big, huge tree. Doesn't work that way. And yet often, okay, Pastor Samuel asked me to give my offering, so tomorrow morning I need a miracle. I gave my offering tomorrow morning. I need the mortgage to be taken care of. Boom, all right, how's that work? No, you drop it in. And you are consistent with your tithe. You're consistent with your offerings. You're consistent guarding the idea, the thought that God gives you. And you nurture it and you water it and you allow it to begin to grow. And you know what? Sometimes you have to prune it back. Because it doesn't, it goes in the wrong direction. You have to water it, and you water it a long time before you even see a little teeny thing come out. You see, he gave an example that everybody could relate to, but nobody wanted to. That is not what they wanted to hear. Little teeny start, slow growth. No, but when it matures, when it grows up, it becomes shelter for the whole garden. And the birds coming in and resting and nesting means that people from all around, all different walks, all different areas of life are going to come and find shelter in that. If God's dropped a business idea in you, cultivate it. It doesn't happen overnight. But when it grows, you provide opportunities for other people to realize their dreams, for their gifts and their anointings and their talents to be built out. So when he began to say, look, it's a seed, the man took the seed and he sowed it in his field. He made a choice. He made a deliberate choice to shift. And he took what seemed small and insignificant, and he made a decision to take that and plant it and cultivate it and grow it, because he knew that the long-term benefit was going to be worth it. That was not what they had in mind. When Dr. Buddy and Mary started the Life Center, it was 30 years ago. And I remember meeting over in, we all heard the barn, right? What you didn't hear a whole lot about was that guess who pulled the chairs over in the barn? Guess who carried the chairs over there and set them up so that people could have somewhere to sit? See that little petite lady right there? She was the one who carried those chairs. Now that is not a big ministry vision. That's not how we see a big ministry with sweeping impact around the world. And for years, it was a little bit at a time. And that barn kind of got shifted and the walls knocked out until it couldn't get knocked anymore. And then all of a sudden this, and now it starts to look a little more like a ministry. It's got a big church and a parking lot that's paved and everything. But it took a long time for that to get there. And that had to be cultivated. The dream that God has given you, the thing that God has placed inside of you may take a little while. It may take some cultivating. But when it is grown, kingdom will be demonstrated. Amen? Amen. So what seed have you planted? Which seed have you chosen to plant? There's a, I don't know, actually I don't have any idea what they are. We have a little bird feeder out in our backyard on my deck, which the squirrels seem to be inordinately fond of. Many of you don't know, but I have a running battle with squirrels. And Elder Pat is one of my best friends. Many years ago, because of my frustration with the squirrels, invested in a squirrel-proof bird feeder. Now that's the love of a friend, right? Okay. So I proudly put out my squirrel-proof bird feeder. And my squirrel-proof bird feeder has a little tray, and it's on a spring. And so if anything heavier than a bird, it shuts off the seeds. Right? The other day, I took a picture, and I sent it to her. And the squirrel had climbed up on top of the bird feeder. And he had one paw pushing down the bar. And the other one was scooping seeds into his mouth just about as hard and fast as he could. And I sent her and I said, squirrel-proof bird feeder, huh? Now, what does that have to do with this? Because here's what I noticed. The seeds flew out, and I have all my pots and, all my actual legitimate flowers, right? And these seeds flew out, and they fell into my pot. And it seemed like within 2 days, all of a sudden, I have this crop of grass, ryegrass, or whatever it is. I don't know what it is. In my orchids. In my orchids, mind you, where they do not belong. You see, there are some seeds, some little itty-bitty seeds that can drop into things and they sprout up fast. Problem is they have very few roots and they wither very quickly. And so as a result of that, you have things that spring up quickly, but there's no fruit to them. There's no value to them. They don't last. And that happens if we're not careful with the seed that we plant. We can take the shortcut, plant the quick seed, try to get quick results, or we can plant the kingdom seed and get God's results. So let's look at the next one. Do you see kingdom or do you see natural circumstances? What is your perception and how has it colored your perspective? We can look at the circumstances around us. If our perception is correct of who God is and what his kingdom is supposed to be and do in us, then when we start to look at the circumstances around us, we will see God's kingdom at work even when, how could Paul, after being beaten and shipwrecked and Lord, the whole list goes on and on, how could he say, yet I am excited for what God's doing. God's kingdom is advancing. I'm sorry, that didn't look like advancement to me. If he had had a perspective of it's got to be a natural result, it's got to be something that happens quickly, he'd have been depressed and distressed and probably given up. But instead, he knew his perspective of who God was and his perception of Christ being God's Son. And as a result of that, he could look at the circumstances, no matter what they were, and say, God's on the throne. All things work together for good when we are called according to God's purposes, right? How do you get that perspective? You have to have a perception of who God is and his kingdom and what he's doing in us. There was another problem that was being addressed. And that problem became the fact that everything around religion was based on an external act. It was all geared to what I see. How long was your cloak? Did you have the tassels on it? Did you wear your, phylacteries on your arm? And, how well did you follow the rules? And Jesus was there to say, look, it's not about how you follow the rules. It's what's going on in your heart. He used, right after the parable of the mustard seed, he used the parable of the leaven. Let's see that leaven parable. So he says, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and worked into 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. And all of these things Jesus said in parables, and he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I'll open my mouth in parables. I'll utter things unknown and unattainable that have been hidden from mankind since the foundation of the world. Now, when Jesus addressed right after his context about the kingdom with the mustard seed, he said, let me tell you something else. Let me tell you about leaven for a minute. Now, in the Jewish culture, leaven was bad. Leaven was equated with sin. So he really messed them up with that one. First thing he did was he took something that their whole perspective was, that's bad. And he said, hey, this woman took this leaven and she worked it into her flour. She made a deliberate effort to work and massage it in. Now, if that is the case, what are you working into your life? You see, she took it. Let's go to that next slide. It was leaven. It was something that everybody considered bad. But she took that situation, she took that circumstance, and she worked it into what she had. And as a result, it permeated, it flavored everything. It impacted all of the dough. You see, when kingdom is developed in your life, when God's perspective, when your perception of God is in alignment, and your perspective of who he is and what he's doing is in alignment, and that gets worked into every area of your life. It gets worked into your business when things are going well and when they're going badly. It gets worked into your family when family's all wonderful or when family's having a problem. It gets worked into relationships when relationships are in harmony and when they're not in harmony. It gets worked into your finances when your finances are on top or when they're down on the very bottom. You see, it doesn't matter any longer when the kingdom perspective, when God's perspective, when those two things are set in place, who he is and what he's doing in your life, when those things get put into perspective, then it doesn't matter what it is, what misfortune, what situation, good or bad, when it gets worked in, you end up with kingdom. Are you allowing God's kingdom to be worked into all areas of your life? For most of us, we need still to work on our perspective. We need to work on our perception. For me, one of the things that God challenged me with as I was studying and working on this week was, Robin, do you really believe I am who I say I am? You know, and my first response was, well, of course. And then God began to catalog some of the things that I was doing that said, your perception is not what you claim it is. Because you see, if my perception were in the right place, then my perspective, I wouldn't be whining. You can't whine. If your perspective is based on the appropriate perception of who God is, whining isn't an option. Why? Because all things work together for good. How can you whine when things are going to be good? My toes were stepped on a lot this week. So the key is, what I want to leave with us today, what does kingdom look like? You see, Jesus came to do a culture shift, but it had to start with, who do you say that I am? Who am I to you? And then as a result of that, are you seeing the world through kingdom eyes? Are you seeing the situation? Are you seeing the challenges? Are you seeing the positive things? Listen, I sat this week, for whatever reason, the radio was turned on and, you know, one of the shows was on, and of course it was just non-stop negative. Oh my goodness. And I wasn't really paying a lot of attention. It was kind of going on in the background, and all of a sudden I thought, man, I'm feeling heavier and heavier, and I realized, wait a minute, those things are shifting my perspective. I got to come back in touch with my perception of who God is. Because, you know, the louder those things get, your perception is God gets smaller. We begin to believe that it's too big for God. My vision that I have is too big for God. The dream that God gave me for a business or the ministry or whatever it is that God put in my heart, it's going to be too big for God. And he says, go back in touch with your perception of who I am. Because if we have the right perception of who God is, our perspective shifts. Nothing's too difficult for him. Nothing is impossible with God. So I'd like for us to stand. What I wanted to do today was to put a little framework around how we read parables, maybe from here on out. And when we begin to see what God is saying, where is he talking? Is he talking to us about the context of what we're looking at? Is he having to shift our context? Or is he dealing with the content of our heart, maybe? Or are there instructions that God is giving us that we haven't followed through with? See, he's always talking to us in one of those three areas, moving us towards the vision of the kingdom. So as we pray this morning, I'm going to ask for us to do just a little bit of soul searching. And the first question is, God, do I have the right perception of who you are? Have I lost my perception of who you are? And I'm just going to pray for a minute. Father, I ask, Lord, that as you have touched our hearts, Lord, as you've quickened our hearts, maybe you've pricked our hearts, that I ask that you give us a new revelation, a new perception of who you are. Lord, as we align our perception with who you are King of kings and Lord of lords, the Lion of Judah, the captain of the host, Lord Sabaoth, the victor, the one who has conquered death, hell, and the grave, the one who gave everything for us, who loved us so much that he gave it all, that he set aside his glory. Lord, you set aside your kingly right in order to come and shift our perception, not only of you, but of the Father, so that we could have a perception of your kingdom and begin to walk in the habits and the attitudes and the behaviors of the kingdom. Align us today, Lord. Align us today, Lord. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.